Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the intersection of philosophical naturalism with paleoconservatism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. For today's episode, I will be looking at Suicide of the West, an essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism by James Burnham. This book was published in 1964, same year as the book that we reviewed last episode. This time period in the early 1960s and the 1950s and around that, even the late 1940s, that was kind of a period when a lot of what we understand to be conservatism today was formed. Those initial ideas, a lot of this revolved around the founding of National Review magazine, but not just that magazine. There were other magazines at the time and other thinkers at the time, but a lot of stuff maybe sort of triggered by the end of World War II and the publication of The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek and God and Man at Yale by William Buckley. And a lot of these ideas started kind of coming to the foreground. The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk. My understanding is that that book actually sort of gave the name conservatism to the movement that was forming at that time. So in this time period, this maybe like 20-year time period, we'll say, 44 to 64 approximately, those thinkers are the people who put together some of the ideas that we understand conservatism to be today. So I think it's important for us to look back to those books and those thinkers to have an understanding of where some of the ideas that we adhere to come from and how applicable they are today, and looking at maybe some of the ways that conservatism has changed from then till now and some of the ways it's stayed the same, and also, can we look to some of these previous thinkers, some of these foundational thinkers, to maybe reinvigorate some of the ideas that we have today, find areas where we've perhaps gone astray, other areas that we need to refocus on, and things like that. So again, 1964, James Burnham published this book, Suicide of the West. He's got a couple of other books. I think some of them are more well-known. I believe one is called The Managerial Revolution. That one is quite well-known. But this one is perhaps, I think, a little bit more geared toward the general public. It's not quite as maybe academic as some of his other books. I think that this one is considered a little bit more of a polemic. And this book, it disappointed me in some ways, although there were parts of it that I found really interesting and that I want to talk about. Obviously, there's enough in this book that I find valuable that I'm going to review it, but I will say that there was not enough in this book, in my opinion, that addressed what I thought I was getting, which was a more deep analysis of a suicidal tendency within Western civilization. That's something that I do want to explore in this podcast, and I didn't find as much of that in this book as I thought I would, given the title of the book. And another thing about the book that bothered me a little bit was how he measures the health or the success of Western civilization. He looks a lot at the geographic footprint on the map. That's kind of how he opens it up, is if you look at the map. But what he's looking at really are like colonial territories. And so as the West began to give up its colonies in the the late 19th and early 20th century, these different areas gained their independence. So he looks at the map and says, okay, well, the influence of Western civilization has receded based on what we see on the map, but I don't think that's a real good analysis of the health of a civilization. I'm not so sure that the colonial territories actually enhanced the health of the West, as much as James Burnham seems to think that it did. So I look at modern Western civilization, and it's more of a drive towards self-destruction. And a total rejection of the traditions and the values that have built Western civilization. So it's kind of a self-loathing, and that's more of a psychological concern rather than like a geographic concern, and that's not really addressed in this book as much as I would like. He talks a little bit about a sort of a suicidal drive, but it's I found it really unsatisfactory, and so I actually don't want to talk about those components of the book, but there are other parts of the book that I found pretty rewarding. He lays out 19 points that form the foundational thesis of liberalism. Now, this is obviously, he's a conservative, and as a side note, he was originally a communist. He was fairly active in socialist communist circles prior to World War II, but I think it was his understanding of how things unfolded in the Soviet Union and the atrocities that were being committed in the Soviet Union, the lies, the cover-ups, and just the absolute totalitarian tyranny that unfolded in the Soviet Union, which was supposed to be this communist example for the world. And it was, in the end, obviously utterly failed. But even at this time in 1964, when he wrote this book, it was successful in the sense that we were in that was like the depth of the Cold War. I mean, our understanding was that the Soviet Union posed an existential threat to us. But at the same time, he saw that it wasn't good, it wasn't healthy, and it wasn't a positive development for humanity. So, like many others in that time frame, I think that we can include Frank Meyer as well, but many people who were communists kind of came around to conservatism once they began to understand how communism actually unfolds in reality, as opposed to in theory. So you have to take it with a grain of salt when he describes what liberalism is, because this is not like a liberal saying, hey, this is what we stand for. This is him looking at liberalism and saying, this is what I see. But I found it pretty interesting, and it really kind of meshes well with some of the other things that we've looked at, some of the other books that we've looked at. So I want to talk a little bit about his definition of liberalism, and he talks a little bit about ideology and how liberalism can be defined as an ideology, what ideologies are, and how they're dangerous. And then he talks a little bit about guilt, and I think that's interesting because that sense of guilt that he talks about ties in with some of the other things that we have looked at as far as the morality of liberalism and the morality of Christianity, and whether there are moral components of Christianity that have filtered into liberalism. So he talks a little bit about guilt for the Christian and guilt for the liberal, and so I'm going to look at that, and then I'm going to try to take that along in some of the future books and see if we can find more about the concept of guilt. But to start off, I'm going to jump right into Chapter 3, which is called Human Nature and the Good Society. And this is where he begins to lay out his premise for what liberalism is. So, like all of the books I review, I'm going to read some significant sections of the book. I want you to really hear it in his words so that you can understand what he's saying, what his point is, and then I'm going to provide some comments on that. So he basically lays out, I believe, 19 different points that define what liberalism is on a number of different topics. He breaks it out into like 3 chapters, I think, as he bit by bit goes through these 19 points. I don't want to cover all 19 of them. I only want to discuss the first 5. What he kind of does is he lays out the first few, and then everything unfolds from there. So it's kind of a logical progression that if you accept the first premise, and really I think the first 2 premises, because I don't think the second premise draws directly from the first, and you'll understand what I mean when I start getting into what these are. But from the combination, I would say, of the first 2 premises, the other 17 premises unfold from that logically. It's like if these 2 are true, then the third premise is true, and then therefore the fourth premise is true, and so on and so forth. So it kind of like logically unfolds this, but the whole thing depends upon the accuracy of the first two premises. Now, I believe that both of the first two premises are incorrect. So every other premise that follows from that is either incorrect, or if it is correct, it's not correct for the reasons that liberalism sets up as why it is correct. But everything following from those first two premises becomes called into question because those first two premises are simply not correct. So I'm going to read a bit where he talks about the very first premise of liberalism. So in this section, he says, quote, "The logical starting point for liberalism, as for most other ideologies, is a belief about the nature of man. On this point, as on many of the others, it is unwise to try to be too precise in formulation. Liberalism is not an exact and rigid doctrine in either its psychological or social function or its logical structure. Its beliefs are not like theorems in geometry or Spinoza, questions in scholastic philosophy, or theses in Hegel. We must understand them in a looser, more flexible sense, with plenty of modifiers like on the whole, more or less, and by and large. Some of the beliefs of liberalism should be thought of as expressing tendencies or presumptions, rather than as attempting to state laws or precise hypotheses. Nevertheless, even if rough or vague, a belief can be meaningful, significantly different from contrasting beliefs, and exceedingly important from a practical standpoint. That disclaimer recorded, we may assert that liberalism believes man's nature to be not fixed but changing, with an unlimited, or at any rate indefinitely large, potential for positive, good, favorable, progressive development. This may be contrasted with the traditional belief expressed in the theological doctrines of original sin and the real existence of the devil, that human nature had a permanent, unchanging essence, that man is partly corrupt, as well as limited in his potential. Man, according to liberalism, is born ignorant, not wicked, declares Professor J. Salwin Shapiro, writing as a liberal on liberalism. He then goes on to say, quote, "The decisive distinction is probably this. Modern liberalism, contrary to the traditional doctrine, holds that there is nothing intrinsic to the nature of man that makes it impossible for human society to achieve the goals of peace, freedom, justice, and well-being that liberalism assumes to be desirable and to define the good society. Liberalism rejects the essentially tragic view of man's fate, found in nearly all pre-Renaissance thought and literature, Christian and non-Christian alike." End quote. So, there you have it in a nutshell. The first premise of liberalism is that man's nature is plastic and flexible to such a degree that we can eventually achieve a perfect or near perfect society, and we have no inherent constraints as to our ability to develop good qualities in ourselves and in others, to rationally build systems that work the way we want them to. And conservatism or traditionalism tends to take a different view that mankind is limited. We have negative qualities. We have greed. We have hatred. We have jealousy and pettiness and ignorance and whatever, wickedness, so on and so forth, that are just fundamental to the human character, will never be eliminated from humanity. And the best that we can do is try to arrange a society in such a way that perhaps one person's vices can serve to constrain another person's vices, and we can kind of set people's vices against one another so that nobody can really do too much damage. That tends to be more the conservative view. And we've seen that in a lot of stuff that we've looked at. I mean, this really traces back to Thomas Sowell's book, A Conflict of Visions, which was one of the books that I most highly recommended when he talks about the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision, the constrained vision being more the conservative vision and the unconstrained vision being more of the liberal vision. And this comes up also in Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, where the idea of the existence of human nature, that we have certain inborn tendencies and whatever, is scientifically true. It's backed up by, psychological and genetic research, but that sort of research is really opposed by, or, especially was, say, in like the 1960s, 1970s, was really opposed. It's been so largely supported now that, many like evolutionary psychologists and psychologists in general will say, yeah, obviously we have a particular nature to us. We have a particular way about us. But that was like really, really opposed by the activist sect of academia. So that's the first premise. It's been an ongoing thread in the podcast episodes so far, and I guarantee that will continue to be a point of conversation. So I'm going to move to the second point that he makes, the second premise of liberalism. So in this section, he says, quote, "The liberal ideology is rationalist. Professor Oakeshott, as I have mentioned, clarifies liberalism as simply a special case of what may in general be called rationalism. Reason, according to rationalism, is not only what distinguishes man in logical definition from other species, as Aristotle stated, though meaning something rather different by reason. Reason is man's essence, and in a practical sense his chief and ultimately controlling characteristic. Liberalism is confident that reason and rational science, without appeal to revelation, faith, custom, or intuition, can both comprehend the world and solve its problems. The liberal as rationalist is described by Professor Oakeshott. He stands for independence of mind on all occasions, for thought free from obligation to any authority save the authority of reason. His circumstances in the modern world have made him contentious. He is the enemy of authority, of prejudice, of the merely traditional, customary, or habitual. His mental attitude is at once skeptical and optimistic. Skeptical because there is no opinion, no habit, no belief, nothing so firmly rooted or so widely held that he hesitates to question it and to judge it by what he calls his reason. Optimistic because the rationalist never doubts the power of his reason when properly applied to determine the worth of a thing, the truth of an opinion, or the propriety of an action. The rationalism enters into the definition of human nature, as Professor Shapiro explains. In general, liberals have been rationalists, holding the conviction that man is essentially a rational creature. What is known as rationalism endeavors, by using reason, to subject all matters, religious as well as non-religious, to critical inquiry. The rationalist looks primarily to science for enlightenment. Reason is his mentor. Hence, what cannot stand the test of reason is not to be accepted. Professor Sidney Hook has squeezed the entire definition of liberalism into a single, unintentionally ironic phrase, faith in intelligence. End quote. Now, this is true. I think that this is true to an extent, but I think that there are some necessary qualifiers that need to be stated. Number one, I don't think that the first premise and the second premise, in a sense, they completely contradict one another if one were to say that man is essentially a rational creature. Because the first premise is that man has no particular nature to him that would constrain him in any way. And to say that man is a rational creature is right off the bat to say that, well, here's our nature. We are rational beings. But what I think that is more accurate would be to say that the second premise is really that reason and rationality are the mechanisms by which we can arrive at the truth. So then, mankind, being infinitely flexible, has the capacity to then use this mechanism of reason and rationality to its utmost extent, with no limitations on our capacity for rational comprehension. But I think that another caveat has to be stated that this book is written in 1964, so this is more than 50 years ago. Since then, we've seen, and maybe even around the time this book was written, and in the following decade, like the 1970s especially, we saw the rise of postmodernism, which begins to say that rationalism and reason are simply mechanisms for keeping the existing power structures in place, and that it discounts other ways of knowing, other ways of understanding that are non-rational. And so postmodernism really dissolves a lot of the dedication to rational discourse. And postmodernism has had a significant impact on liberalism and progressivism, more so like progressivism, if you want to make a distinction, so that, rationality is not quite considered like the only real way of coming to an understanding of the world. There's much more of a concentration on like lived experience, right? And people's emotional reactions to things, how they perceive things to be, as opposed to that's why, you hear people talk like Ben Shapiro, I think, in the modern era uses the phrase, facts don't care about your feelings, right? Isn't that itself a very rationalist approach? In a way, I think it really is. If you assume that, this isn't like necessarily a philosophical rationalism that is kind of transcendent of facts and is more like purely logical. But I think that what he means when he talks about rationalism and reason, obviously you have to incorporate facts into a rational discourse about reality. But the idea is that feelings, emotions, impressions, they're not as relevant to understanding reality as, say, empirical facts are, which, that's kind of a stand against the intuitive, emotion-based understanding that many on the left hold today. So my point here is that the dedication to rationalism is not, in the modern era, as secure as it may have been, in the first half of the 20th century, when, you were still dealing with the impacts of logical positivism and the explosion of new ways of understanding reality, the dispersal of Darwinism through the intellectual world, the understanding of quantum physics and things like that. And so everything was really like, oh, this is a rational, science-based way of understanding the world. And that had just really influenced liberalism to an extent that I don't think it does anymore now. So anyway, I do think that is important. I don't want to discount it entirely. I don't want to say that that's not accurate. It's just that it needs a bit of disclaimer to account for the rise of postmodernism. But anyway, so between those 2 points combined, really everything else unfolds from there. So I'm going to go to the third point. He makes the third point very briefly. I'm going to read you the entirety of what he says about the third point. It's really only a small paragraph, but he says, quote, "Since there is nothing in essential human nature to block achievement of the good society, the obstacles thereto must be and are extrinsic or external. The principal obstacles are, specifically as liberalism sees them, 2. Ignorance, an accidental and remedial, not intrinsic and essential state of man, and bad social institutions." End quote. And that's all he says for point 3 there, but that becomes the basis of much of the rest of the points. But he's basically saying that since humanity doesn't have any intrinsic, inherent reasons why we can't achieve the quote-unquote good society, the society that we want and that we can strive toward, this, what we're progressing toward, and progressivism is that we're moving toward this like better world. And the only thing that was keeping us away from this better world is ignorance, right? Ignorance is not a inherent quality. It's just an accidental state of not having adequate information, being uneducated and not being as, woke or whatever it may be, that we just don't know, or we don't understand, or we're ignorant about some certain circumstances, social or whatever. And that would be what holds us back. And the second thing that would hold us back would be the institutions that exist in our society that are built on ignorant understandings of rational processes and ignorant understandings of human nature and so on and so forth. So these bad institutions built, perhaps on greed or on oppression or whatever it may be, these institutions hold us back and our ignorance holds us back. So what we need to do then would be to educate people and to dismantle the institutions that are preventing us from reaching the state of society that we are striving toward. Okay? So that's point 3, is that those are the things holding us back. And then he goes to point 4. So, point 4, he says, quote, "From these doctrines of human plasticity and rationality, and of the external remediable character of the obstacles to the good society, there follows belief in progress, what might be called historical optimism." He then goes on to say, quote, "There is a double aspect to this historical optimism. The peaceful, just, free, virtuous, prosperous, and so on society is, on the one hand, the desirable goal for mankind. But in addition, the good society is to be the actual outcome of historical development, either inevitably, as Condorcet and many other pre-liberals and liberals have believed and even tried to prove, or scheduled to come about on the condition that human beings behave rationally, that is, accept the liberal ideology, program, and leadership. It is the second predictive aspect that is the more distinctive attribute of liberalism. There are others who agree with liberals about specifications of the good society, though not everyone. There are some persons who have favored, some who still do favor quite different social arrangements, and still others who do not have any goal at all for secular society, either because their goal is not of this world, or because they think that a general social goal is silly. But even among those non-liberals who do share the liberal goal, many would look at it not as an attainable target, but merely as a somewhat obscure ideal that can sometimes provide rough guidance for social conduct or inspiration for social effort. That is to say, it is characteristic of liberals, and perhaps of all ideologues, to believe that there are solutions to social problems. Most liberals, and nearly all their intellectual forebears, have believed that there is a general solution to the social problem, that the good society, or a reasonable facsimile thereof, can actually be realized in this world. The 20th century liberal, like his 18th century forebears, believes that free men have the intellectual capacity and moral resources to overcome the forces of injustice and tyranny, was the way Hubert Humphrey restated the tradition in 1959. End quote. Okay, so this is the fourth point here, and this is essentially that this is the belief in progressivism, that there is a solution, there is a mechanism by which we can arrive at the good society, and through historical progress, we move closer to it. We set up an ideal, and we find that there is a solution. Now, what the solution is going to be debated by different liberals as to what the best mechanism is for achieving the good society. But the idea is that it is achievable, and that it is through the historical development of humanity that we get closer to it, essentially. So he says basically that many people who are not liberals but share in the basic goal of this good society are going to see it as an ideal that can guide our decisions, but not necessarily have a true belief that we are going to get there. More that it's just kind of an ideal. You know, I mean, that's what makes it an ideal, is that it's not actually achievable in the real world. It's just something that we can consider when we make our decisions. But the diehard liberal, believes that we can get there if we make the right decisions socially, if we embrace the right policies, and And so that's basically the core of progressivism. That was number 4, and then I guess the last one I want to touch on is number 5. So in number 5, he says, quote, "The ignorance and bad social conditions that cause the world's evils and block progress are the legacy of the past. The product, Professor Shapiro puts it, of the errors and injustices of the past. There is therefore no reason to favor ideas, institutions, or modes of conduct merely because they have been long established, because our ancestors accepted them. Their ancient lineage is, if anything, a ground for suspicion. We should, rather, be ready to undertake prompt and even drastic and extensive innovations if these recommend themselves from a rational and utilitarian standpoint. Thus, liberalism is anti-traditional. I rather think that the attitude toward tradition furnishes the most accurate single shibboleth for distinguishing liberals from conservatives, and still more broadly the left from the right, since with respect to change, the revolutionary and the reactionary are merely pushing the respective attitudes of liberal and conservative toward their limits. In the New York Times Magazine article on the definition of liberalism, to which I've already referred, Senator Humphrey particularly insists on change as the key. It is this emphasis on changes of chosen ends and means which most sharply distinguishes the liberal from a conservative in a democratic community. The dictionary defines a liberal as favorable to change and reform, tending in the direction of democracy. In the political lexicon of 1959, liberals recognized change as the inescapable law of society, and action in response to change as the first duty of politics. We may put the question this way. Does the fact that a particular idea, institution, or mode of conduct has been established for some while create a presumption in favor of continuing it? To this question, a conservative will answer with a definite yes, and a liberal with no or very little. This does not mean that a conservative never or a liberal always wants to change what is. It is the revolutionary nihilist, not the liberal, who thinks everything to be wrong, and the reactionary, not the conservative, who wants nothing altered, unless perhaps in order to return to the past. For the conservative, there might be some new circumstance cogent enough to call for a change in the prevailing ways, in spite of his presumption in their favor, and the liberal is, on occasion, content to let well enough alone. But the difference in presumption, bias, trend, remains." End quote. So here we're basically saying, all right, if achievement of the good society is possible through historical progress, and if what is holding us back from the good society is ignorance or faulty institutions, then the liberal inherently is going to look at the existing institutions and traditions and ways of the past, the components of the past, suspiciously, and say that if these things are long established, they're probably contributing to holding us down. And that in order for us to reach the good society, we have to have a dedication to change and to reform. And so the liberal, particularly, he says the revolutionary, especially, thinks everything is wrong, everything is broken, we should burn it all down, and we should start from scratch, because nothing from the past has any value. It's all tainted by the injustices of the past. Everything is corrupt, and everything must be looked at critically, and in the eyes of some of the more far left, that everything must be dismantled, and that nothing that has roots in the past, it's all tainted by racism, or it's tainted by patriarchy, or it's tainted by ignorance or bigotry or whatever it may be, injustice that has pervaded through the past. It's all corrupted, and it all needs to be burned down so that we can build the good society on its ashes. Now, that's the revolutionary. The liberal is a few steps back from that, and, in my eyes, tends to serve more as a cheerleader or apologist for the revolutionary, letting the revolutionary do the dirty work while they run cover. Then the conservative is going to say, all things considered, we will allow for a preference for those things which already exist. The traditions which exist, particularly if they've existed for a long time, it must be because they work. It must be because they've provided some value to the people of the past. And even if we don't understand them completely, we should still give a deference to it. Now, the reactionary, in Burnham's description here, the reactionary says, don't change anything. Or, at best, only change things to return to a previous state. That every movement or progress forward is bad. The conservative is not quite as far down that road, and the conservative says, okay, we will give deference to tradition, but not in a radical fashion, so that we allow room for reform. And this goes right back to Edmund Burke talked about the same thing. And any reasonable conservative is going to say, okay, yeah, circumstances change, we learn new things, our temperament changes. It's entirely possible to reform components of tradition and of civilization that are not working, did not work, aren't working presently, and that need to be reformed. It's not like everything that exists is always good, that nothing is ever built on ignorance or bigotry or anything else, that there are institutions that are based on these things and they need to be reformed. But all other things being equal, then a tradition should stand. So that's basically the conservative position. So those are the first five. I wanted to read those first five because I wanted to get to the number 5 there, which is, I think really the core of the issue. If you look back to the origin of the term left and right, it refers to the French Assembly, I believe in the Revolutionary era, where the people who sat on the left were like the Jacobins and the more revolutionaries, and the people who sat on the right were the ones who were more amenable to the monarchy, more amenable to keeping the traditions of France intact. And so really if you look at that, which I do, since it's the origin of the term, if you look at that as really kind of the defining factor of the left and the right, then yeah, it's the left is all about change, and the right is all about stability and preservation and conservation or conservatism. So those are the points that I wanted to make. And then he goes on from a bunch more points from there. Like I said, there are 19 of them total, where he gets into education and he gets into systems of welfare and all these other things that all kind of unfold from those premises. And you can see how each premise takes some of the components of the previous premise and develops it further. Now, there's a point here where he refutes some of this. He doesn't spend a lot of time refuting it, but he does refute it a little bit. I'll get to that in a moment, but first I want to read a section here where he talks about ideology, because essentially he's claiming that what we're looking at in liberalism, as we've described it thus far, is essentially an ideology, which takes a certain premise to be true and then understands the entire world through the lens of that premise. That's essentially what an ideology is. And if liberalism takes its cue from that first, or from those first two premises, and then views everything through those premises, it is an ideology. So when he talks about ideology, he says, quote, "There is a test fairly simple in theory, though not always easy to carry out, that will show one whether we are dealing with an ideology. Suppose we ask a man who believes so-and-so, what specific evidence, what observations, happenings, experiments might conceivably prove you wrong? He is, let us say, an all-out anti-Semite. Will he admit and stand by the admission that if such and such happens, then that will prove his anti-Semitic beliefs to be wrong? Of course not. No matter what happens, he will regard it as either irrelevant or one more proof of his doctrine. If there is any seeming conflict between doctrine and reality, then reality, not the doctrine, must give way. This is exactly what proves that his system of beliefs is not a meaningful assertion about what is or is not the case in the real world, but an ideology, the primary function of which is not to state truths, but to adjust attitudes. The rules for a meaningful assertion about the real world are entirely different. If I say that it is 75 feet from here to the driveway, my statement may in fact be 100% true, but it would be proved false, and everyone would recognize that it would be proved false if we measured the distance with a tape or other suitable instrument and got as the result something other than 75 feet. If I say that at a given temperature, the volume and pressure of a gas vary inversely, then there is no difficulty in conceiving how I might be proved wrong, though I am in fact right. Namely, if I measure the two quantities and find that they do not vary inversely. And then he goes on to say, quote, "It is a characteristic of ideological thinking, whatever the given ideology, that it cannot be refuted by logical analysis or empirical evidence. Actually, the internal logical structure of a developed ideology is usually quite good anyway, rather like the logical structure of paranoiac obsessions, which ideologies resemble in other ways also. And when a logical gap appears, as happened to liberalism in the doctrinal shift from limited to welfare state, sufficient ingenuity can always patch it up again. As we duly noted, the ideology is a way of interpreting the world, an attitude toward the world, and a method for dealing with the world. So long as I adhere faithfully to the ideology, there is no specific happening, no observation or experiment that can unmistakably contradict it. I can always adjust my categories and my attitude to allow for whatever it is that happens or that I observe. If necessary, I can shut my eyes." End quote. So that's a short description of the ideology and how essentially dedication to an ideology trumps all observations of reality. And so people who are really dedicated to ideologies, they inevitably wind up spinning out these conspiracy theories of one flavor or another that basically force the world to conform to the ideology rather than allowing the ideology to conform to the world. And thus there's no way of proving an ideology wrong, because whatever proof is presented, whatever evidence is presented, is simply spun in such a manner that it either is irrelevant or it reinforces the ideology. He talks about anti-Semitism as an ideology, so that no matter what you put forward, there's always a way to say, well, it's obviously that's just an additional layer of the Jewish conspiracy or whatever it may be. And that's what you see in liberalism as an ideology, as a way of understanding the world rather than an empirical observation about the world. It's a way of understanding the world in order to achieve a certain end, or in order to provide some sort of mental stability so that one doesn't have to it's a way of providing like a certainty about the world. If you can boil the world down to like a bumper sticker slogan or some sort of rudimentary way to understand the world, some lens through which you can understand everything, you then feel like you understand everything. You understand the world. No matter what happens, you can interpret it according to your bumper sticker slogan. That's ideology. And we see it on the left and on the right. I won't lie. And I think more today than when this book was written, we have seen these sorts of ideologies arise on the right so that people understand the world through this sort of bumper sticker slogan. But that's ideology, and that's what we should be avoiding. And there are many writers and thinkers like Burnham and also Russell Kirk to a pretty significant degree, and others, Pat Buchanan, who really say that what conservatism should be is the rejection of ideology. And so that was his comment on ideology, and I think that's important for us to understand. So the next part that I want to talk about is where he makes some attempt to refute liberalism. This is a little bit longer section I'm going to read here. But I think it's pretty interesting and important for us to at least take a moment to point out that these premises that liberalism is built on are not actually true. They're not accurate. It's not an accurate understanding of the world. So here he says, quote, "This book is in no way concerned to refute liberalism. The question of the truth or falsity of an ideology is in any case of minor importance. Human beings believe in ideology, as a rule, not because they are convinced rationally that it is true, but because it satisfies psychological and social needs and serves or seems to serve individual or group interests. Still, I do not want to hide my own conviction, nor could I if I would, that the 19 constituent beliefs in the liberal list are, so far as they can be judged in terms of truth and falsity, false on the available evidence, and that, though they may not be internally inconsistent, they are pragmatically contradictory in the sense that they lead, in practice, and necessarily lead to results that violate their own premises and intentions. Though I shall not attempt to offer a sufficient case for this summary judgment, I will motivate it briefly with respect to 2 or 3 of the crucial liberal beliefs, not so much in order to prove these beliefs false, as to suggest that they are at any rate not self-evidently true. Let us consider then the liberal theory of human nature. According to liberal doctrine, human beings are not innately corrupt or defective or subject to essential limitations in their psychological and social dimensions. Obviously, there are certain physical limitations to which human beings are subject, though these and their possible consequences for individual conduct and social life are usually not stressed in discussion of the human potential by liberal ideologues. Human beings are capable of an unlimited, or at least indefinitely great, advance toward the good life and the good society. There is nothing ineradicably evil in human nature or the human psyche. On the contrary, the primary motivation of human beings is, or can become, rational, so that once education gets rid of ignorance, prejudice, superstition, and frustrating customs, human beings will conduct themselves reasonably and will thus be able to build a reasonable society of peace, freedom, justice, and material well-being. At the height of the Victorian period, when the articulate part of the world was enjoying the century of approximate peace bestowed by the British Empire, the spreading fruits of the steam engine and the factory system, and the softening early effects of humanitarian and parliamentary triumphs, in that age of what seemed to most educated men, except for a few perverse poets and artists, an historical dawn, if not quite yet full sunshine, this liberal portrait of human nature, inherited from the 18th century Enlightenment, was not altogether implausible, even from a non-ideological perspective. Even then, some scrupulous observers were troubled when they recalled that, as understood by all the centuries of Christianity, the body of faith and belief under which the civilization of Europe and the Americas had taken form, and by all other of the great world religions, man is a creature by essence limited and bounded, his potential goodness corrupted by a portion of evil that by his own efforts cannot be overcome, fated to walk in the valley of the shadow of an alien material universe under unreprovable sentence of death. Those who were inclined to dismiss religious doctrine as superstition might nevertheless have noted that it was borne out in full and terrible detail by the entire history of man in every continent, climate, and region of the earth, in every society, at every stage of development, from primitive tribe to mighty empire constructed by whatever race, black, brown, yellow, red, or white. Only those who know very little about the history of mankind can suppose that cruelty, crime, or weakness, mass slaughter, or mass corruption are exceptions from the normal human rule. A doctrine of human nature that paints a picture of what man might be that is in direct contradiction to what he has always and everywhere been may be a comfort to the spirit, but is not to be taken very seriously as a scientific hypothesis. The fundamental law of every genuine science is the postulate that the pattern of what happens in the future will probably resemble that of what has been observed to happen in the past. Any belief requiring the assumption that the future will be radically different from the past is not only false on the evidence, it could not be otherwise, since the only available evidence to man is the observations he has made in the past. But non-scientific in kind, no matter how many invocations the believer makes to science and reason. If there was a Victorian moment that perhaps excused a brief optimism over the chance that the human future might be radically unlike the past, what can a reasonable man, once he frees himself from ideology, conclude from the record of our own era? the grimmest lessons of the past about the inherent limits and defects of human nature have been continuously confirmed by wars, with tens of millions dead, by mass persecutions and tortures, deliberate starvation of innocents, wanton killings by tens of thousands, the ingenuities of science used to perfect methods of mass terror, new forms of enslavement, gigantic genocides, the wiping out of whole nations and peoples. True enough, the record of the present as of the past is not an unmixed black. The crimes and horrors are mingled with achievements, mercies, and heroism. But in the face of what man has done and does, it is only an ideologue, obsessed with his own abstractions, who can continue to cling to the vision of an innately uncorrupt, rational, and benignly plastic human nature possessed of an unlimited potential for realizing the good society. It is not merely the record of history that speaks in unmistakable refutation of the liberal doctrine of man. Ironically, because it is liberalism that has maintained so exaggerated a faith in science, almost all modern scientific studies of man's nature unite in giving evidence against the liberal view of man as a creature motivated, once ignorance is dispelled, by the rational search for peace, freedom, and plenty. Every modern school of biology and psychology, and most schools of sociology and anthropology conclude that men are driven chiefly by profound, non-rational, often anti-rational sentiments and impulses, whose character and very existence are not ordinarily understood by conscious reason. Many of these drives are aggressive, disruptive, and injurious to others and to society. Some of them, as seen by modern science, are destructive to the self, seeking pain, suffering, even death. And these negative impulses, if they are designated so, are no less integral to the human psyche than those positive impulses pointing toward the liberal ideals. He then goes on to say, quote, "The findings of the modern scientific study of genetics seem to strike a multiple blow at the liberal conception of man and his prospects. The fixity of unit characteristics, their biological transmission through the genes according to mathematical laws of probability, and the non-inheritability of acquired characteristics combine to reinforce the non-liberal belief that human nature has a permanent substratum, that there are ineradicable differences among men not traceable to social circumstance, and that there are limits, often quite low, to what even the most perfect education could accomplish." End quote. So I think that's pretty definitive right there, in my opinion. Any look at the history of human behavior throughout history, throughout recorded history, in every civilization, in every corner of the world, shows us war, death, destruction, and man competing against man for limited resources, and no example of the quote-unquote good society that we somehow are going to strive toward and achieve. There's no history of such a thing anywhere ever. In contrast, even the 20th century has proven to be such an absolute bloodbath that there can be no doubt that human nature is not able to be just easily shaped and directed towards some utopian future society. Mankind is brutally violent and corrupt everywhere, always, and it shall always be so. That's the simple conclusion. And genetics backs up the idea that mankind has a particular nature. Now, I don't want to be unduly pessimistic, but let's just say that genetics backs up the idea that mankind has a particular nature to him. It is at least partly driven by self-interest, and more specifically driven by the perpetuation of one's genetic code at the expense of competing genetic codes. And that's what we are. Which leaves the first and second premise of liberalism inaccurate. We're not... the second premise is... that's something that we'll get into more at a later point. But suffice to say that we're not inherently rational creatures. Our look at thinking fast and slow and some of the irrational behaviors that are hardwired into humanity for specific evolutionary purposes proves that we're not inherently rational. We have rational capacity, but even our rational capacity is limited. And so the first and second, and most particularly and strikingly the first, premise of liberalism is simply not true. So therefore, all of the following premises of liberalism are inherently suspect, because the foundational premise is simply not true. So that's all I'm going to say about that. The last section that I want to read from this book is where he talks about guilt. I'm not going to talk about this section an awful lot. He doesn't talk about it a tremendous amount. He does talk about it a bit. I guess he's got a chapter dedicated to it. I think it's important, and yeah, I suppose this is a sort of longer section that I want to read here as well. I'm not going to talk about it an awful lot. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Let's get into this. So this is chapter 10, The Guilt of the Liberal, and he says, quote, "It has been more than once remarked that modern liberalism, as manifest within the relatively privileged strata of Western society, bears, only lightly concealed, a heavy burden of guilt. To uncover a layer of guilt inside the liberal breast is not, to be sure, a startling discovery. Guilt seems to be an emotion, fever, idea, conviction, whatever it is to be called, that is very widely distributed among men. If one were not committed to a denial of any permanent human nature, one might almost conclude that it is part of man's essence." In Franz Kafka's novel, The Trial, Joseph K., symbol of the mathematical constant, everyman, presumably as well as author and particular reader, is informed by authoritative sources that he is under indictment. K never succeeds in finding out the specifications of the charge, but it becomes quite clear that they are of a capital order, and that he is indeed guilty, since he has already been condemned to death with no possibility of retrieve. Every man, conservative and liberal, communist and fascist, atheist and churchgoer, is, of course, exactly in K's situation, and no matter what his doctrine, he feels at least sometimes the reality of that situation, that is, feels guilty. And occasionally he feels guilty not about this or that deed or thought, but guilty in general, guilty about nothing in particular, that is, about everything. Guilt and the feeling of guilt are facts of the human situation. He then goes on to say, quote, "Let us consider the situation of a member of our affluent society, and let us assume him to be from the more rather than less affluent half, who is no longer deeply committed in spirit to the interlocked Christian doctrines of original sin, the incarnation, and redemption which constitute the Christian solution. His guilt nevertheless exists. He is conscious of it and feels the anxiety that it generates. What is he going to do about it and think about it? Liberalism permits him to translate his guilt into the egalitarian, anti-discrimination, democratist, peace-seeking liberal principles, and to transform his guilty feeling into that passion for reform of which Professor Shapiro speaks. If he is an activist, he can actually sign on as a slum clearer, freedom rider, ban the bomber, or peace corpsman, or join a Dr. Schweitzer or Dr. Dooley in the jungle. But activists of that literal sort are always a minority. The more significant achievement of liberalism, by which it confirms its claim to being considered a major ideology, is its ability to handle the problem of guilt for large numbers of persons without costing them undue personal inconvenience. This it does by elevating the problem to representational, symbolic, and institutional levels. It is not necessary for me to go in person to the slum, jungle, prison, southern restaurant, state house, or voting precinct and there take a direct hand in accomplishing the reform that will unblock the road to peace, justice, and well-being. Thanks to the reassuring provisions of the liberal ideology, I can go about my ordinary business, and meanwhile take sufficient account of my moral duties by affirming my loyalty to the correct egalitarian principles, voting for the correct candidates, praising the activists, and contributing to their defense funds when they get into trouble, and joining promptly in the outcry against reactionaries who pop up now and then in a desperate effort to preserve power and privilege." And then he goes on to say, quote, "Along one perspective, liberalism's reformist, egalitarian, anti-discrimination, peace-seeking principles are, or at any rate can be interpreted as, the verbally elaborated projections of the liberal sense of guilt. I, who have enough to eat and a sufficiently comfortable life, feel guilty, even though I have no direct personal relation with you, because you are hungry, or deprived of civil rights, or suffering political oppression. More exactly, the sequence is the following. I feel guilty, and I do not know why. You are hungry, etc. I attach my guilt to your unhappy state, trying to explain my guilt to myself to give it some sort of objective motivating structure. All this may be too obvious to need saying, and it is obvious, but it is necessary to insist that it is not self-evident and not an inevitable outcome for the guilt experience. And then further on he says, quote, the guilt of the liberal causes him to feel obligated to try to do something about any and every social problem, to cure every social ill. This feeling, too, is non-rational. The liberal must try to cure the evil, even if he has no knowledge of the suitable medicine, or, for that matter, of the nature of the disease. He must do something about the social problem, even when there is no objective reason to believe that what he does can solve the problem, when, in fact, it may as well aggravate the problem instead of solving it. We cannot stand idly by while the world rushes to destruction, or women and children are starving, or able men walk the streets without jobs, or the air becomes polluted, or Negroes can't vote in Zenith, or immigrants live in rat-infested slums, or youngsters don't get a decent education, or whatever. The harassed liberal is relentlessly driven by his Eumenidean guilt. It does not permit him to let well enough alone, or stick to his own cabbage patch, or decide that the trouble is none of his business, or to reflect that, though the evil is undoubtedly there and he is sincerely sorry for its victims, he doesn't understand damn all about it. And even if he did, he hasn't got the brains and resources to fix it up. He may not know much, generally speaking he does not know much, about economics. But that lack in no way inhibits him from demanding that industry and government do this, that, or the other to cure unemployment. He may not have a single serious idea about strategy in international affairs, but he will nevertheless join his fellow liberals in calling for grandiose measures concerning arms, alliances, bases, and colonies. He may have no acquaintance with the actual problems of mass education, but he will nevertheless insist on the most far-reaching reforms of the school system. The peoples of the new underdeveloped nations are hungry, poor, and diseased. Therefore, by the logic of the liberal guilt, we have a duty to give them aid, and we do so, though the objective evidence may show that, at least in a number of cases, the aid given injures rather than helps the recipient, corrupts the officialdom perhaps, subverts the social order, or provokes wild inflation. Our government is obligated to send money to rehabilitate a chronically depressed domestic region, though the objective evidence may show that the area is depressed for good reason, and that the way to help its inhabitants is to get them to move somewhere else. Negro children have feelings of inferiority and alienation when they attend separate schools, so therefore they will go to school with whites. But what if, placed in direct confrontation with whites, the Negro children feel still more alienated? Indonesians have been poor under Dutch colonial rule, so therefore, etc. But after independence, they are not merely poor, but starving. Latin America is in bad political, economic, and social shape, so we will have a $20 billion Alliance for Progress program, but for this and that objective reason, the program will not improve the condition of Latin America, will most likely make it worse. No matter. There is a problem. Where there's a problem, we've got to apply a solution. I do not raise the question whether, in these cited cases, the liberal solution is or is not valid, but merely that it doesn't really make any difference. The real and motivating problem for the liberals is not to cure the poverty or injustice or whatnot in the objective world, but to appease the guilt in their own breasts. And what that requires is some program, some solution, some activity. Whether or not it is the correct program, solution, and activity, the good intention. Slum clearance, racial equality, better health, decolonization, high standards of living, peace, plus plenty of action is assumed to guarantee the goodness of the program, and the badness, one might add, of those reactionaries who are rash enough to question it. End quote. So, yeah, the point here is that he's basically saying that there's an inherent guilt within everybody's being that can't necessarily be traced to any particular misdeed. That we just have this inherent
guilty feeling to us, that liberalism provides a channel for us to do something in the world to make us feel, to assuage the guilt within us. And he talks a little bit, I didn't quote the section, but he talks a little bit about Christianity and how the Christian system of original sin and redemption through Christ provides a mechanism for solving that guilt, that we have a reason for this existential guilt, and that is from original sin, and that we have a mechanism of freeing ourselves from this existential guilt through Jesus Christ. And then he says that, in the part that I quoted, that people will just want it, they just are going to want to do something, to take some sort of action. And as long as their intentions are good and they have the will to act, then their guilt will be appeased. And this, I think, can be seen in the drive. I like to see the drive toward minimum wage as a nice, easy example of this. Most mainstream economics recognizes that there's actually a fundamental problem with minimum wage laws. It's a price floor that distorts the supply and demand of labor. And this distortion creates unemployment, where people aren't going to want to hire somebody who only provides a limited amount of benefit to the company. They're only going to pay somebody in proportion to the amount of benefit they gain from hiring them. Now, if the benefit they gain from hiring them is not equal to the minimum wage, then they're not going to just pay the minimum wage because the government has told them to. They're just not going to hire them because they don't add enough benefit to the company. And so in that manner, the minimum wage laws don't really work. And I think that although it may be disputed by some economists, most economists would agree that doesn't work. And at the very least, it is clearly up for debate. But many liberals who know nothing about economics, who've never taken a single economics course or read a single book about economics, will argue until they're blue in the face about how necessary it is to implement these minimum wage laws because people deserve a living wage. And so it's this intention that we're going to fix this because this is what people deserve and this is what we're going to do, without any understanding of the mechanics of the solution. It doesn't really matter whether the solution works or not. All that matters is that they're acting. We've got to do something. And so then you say, well, what's really being accomplished here? Do we have any kind of real evidence that the problem is being solved? No. We actually have evidence that the problem is not being solved, potentially being exacerbated. But that's not the point. The point is not to solve the problem. The point is to make the liberal feel better, to make them feel like they're good people and that they're doing something so as to ease their sense of existential guilt about the problems that exist in the world. That's at the root of liberalism. Now, I think that there's a lot more that can be opened up and dug into here, because I would question whether or not guilt as such is actually such an inherent component of the human being. I'm not so sure, as a non-Christian conservative, that I feel this sense of pervading existential guilt. And if I can't ease my guilt through Christianity, and I can't ease my guilt through liberalism, that I therefore have this overwhelming feeling of existential guilt that I don't know what to do with. I don't think that's the case. I think that in many ways, liberalism has adopted much of the values of Christianity, even as it has discarded the doctrines. So that the sense of guilt is something that we have acquired as Western individuals, we've acquired as a Western civilization from our Christian past. And even when we let go of Christianity, largely, obviously not entirely, but many people have let go of Christianity, we still carry the Christian values. We still carry the slave morality values, if you want to look at this through a Nietzschean perspective. that we looked at in the genealogy of morality a few books ago. And so Heidegger talks about the sort of existential guilt as well. Now, the Heideggerian existential guilt is traceable back to the idea that we live inauthentic lives. Inherently, nobody can live a perfectly authentic life. We always are less than we could be. And so we always feel sort of existential guilt because we know that we're not entirely authentic. And no one can be entirely authentic. But that doesn't mean that we don't feel the guilt, because we know we could be more than we are. And so this idea of guilt is something that I want to explore further in a psychological sense, in a metaphysical or philosophical sense, in a religious sense. This is an interesting area of examination, but that's as far as I'm going to go in this book. That's about as far as he goes in this book in talking about guilt. And looks like we're past an hour, so I'm going to wrap this up. I've read all the sections that I wanted to read to you today. Thank you for tuning in, and come back next time for more good stuff. Bye now.